Tell me when you're ready. All right. Well, I think we need to pray before we start. But before we even pray, I want to share something with you. So in Scripture, we have a lot of examples of music as worship. And one that I wanted to look at was in Ephesians 5. And in Ephesians 5, Paul is talking, and he says, in verse 15, Ephesians 5, he says, pay careful attention then to how you walk, not as unwise as people as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. Don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Don't get drunk on wine, which leads to reckless actions, but be filled by the Spirit. That's like a contradictory statement, right? He says, don't do this, but this. So that's a rabbit trail we could chase another time at the place of alcohol and drunkenness in a believer's life. It says, don't do this, because if you do this, it's hard to be filled with the Spirit if you're filled with wine. But anyway, but then in verse 19, this is what I wanted to really get to. He says, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making music from your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another in the fear of Christ. Now, I think it's interesting that verses 19 through 21 are all paired together talking about worship. So what are some words that we see in there? Well, we see speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Well, we don't think of songs and hymns and singing as speaking. But but Paul is saying speaking to one another because we think of worship. I'll say this two different ways. A lot of times people that come in the doors of the church think of worship as, what am I going to get out of this? That's the wrong focus, right? Because it's not about us. It's about worship is about ascribing worth. The definition of the word worthship, when you break the word down, it means ascribing worth to something or someone, giving value. So worship means when we say we're here to worship God, we're saying we're giving value and priority to God. We're saying he's valuable, he's worthy of whatever happens here, whatever we do, whatever we give, he's worthy of it. He's worthy of more than what we can give, but he's definitely worthy of all that we can give. But so a lot of times we think of worship as, what am I going to get out of it? Or no, it's not about that. It's about what I can give to God. But what Paul says here, when he's talking about speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So there's also this community dynamic. So people say, well, I can worship at home. I can worship in my car, listen to the radio. I can worship by myself with my headphones on. I don't have to be at church to worship. How are you going to speak to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs if you're not with one another? Right? It's an important dynamic that some people forget about. Because, I mean, most of us, if you're here, you're passionate about music. You're passionate about worship, because you wouldn't be here to help serve in this regard if you weren't. And so when we think about music, how many times has there been a specific song that the lyrics or something in there spoke to you, and it's like, oh, man, that's powerful, or that's exactly what I needed to hear? It happens a lot with me. I mean, really often. Why is that? Because it's different about music than music and poetry is kind of different than other just writing, because there's emotion attached to it. And I'm not saying that worship is all about emotion, but when we really worship God, emotion gets attached to that, because if we're giving everything that we are, everything that we have, and giving value to him above everything else, that should be all of us. Heart, soul, mind, and strength. Emotion is part of that. And so music speaks to us in a way that other forms of things don't, because music specifically draws on emotion. It does. That's why it's different than just reading a book. That's why it's different than just words, because it puts other senses involved, so it's almost like a full body experience. Heart, soul, mind, and strength. So he says to speak to one another, singing and making music from your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and submitting to one another in the fear of Christ. Again, we can't do this on our own. We have to do it with one another. Accountability doesn't happen by yourself. Worship shouldn't happen by yourself either. Can sometimes, but it has to happen collectively too. So you guys are here because the music is a big part of worship. Now let me ask you another question. This may be a soapbox question, but I'll get off of it after I ask. What is the difference between a hymn and like a song, Christian song that you may hear on the radio? By definition, what's the difference? Okay, maybe straight scripture. I've cheated. I have the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, the official definition of a hymn. The number one definition listed, a song of praise to God. So what's a hymn? Any song of praise to God. So we in church have made this like dichotomy of, well, these are spiritual songs or godly songs or worship or praise songs, and these are hymns. Well, at some point, Amazing Grace was just one of those, it's just one of those praise songs. It's not a hymn, it's a praise song. And it's written to a drinking tune. Right? The guy that wrote it, if you've seen this movie Amazing Grace and you've heard the story about how the author was involved in slave trading and then became a Christian and became a pastor afterwards, or repented of all that. But he wasn't really a musician. So he just wrote the words and put it to an already well-recognized tune, and people in England thought it was heresy that he had written this, probably the most well-known, most sang at funerals, everything song that we have in the world today, and wrote it to a drinking tune. They said, this is absolutely, God will not honor this. Oh, no. So sometimes we think about that today, and there's two sides of that. Some people think those old songs, God can't use those anymore. And some people think all those new songs, God's not honored by that. God's honored by anything that ascribes value and worth to him. Anything that says, God, you're worthy, you're great, you're awesome, and declares truth about God. Now, there's probably some songs out there that ascribe some things to God that maybe aren't necessarily true. We have to have a watchful eye for those things. But most Christian songs are just sharing truth about God, right? And talking about how awesome he is. Some of them are, I praise you. Some of them are, we praise you. Or some of them are just declarations, God, you're great. But all of those things give him worth, give him value, or ascribe him. We're assigning him value. It's not that he doesn't already have it. He has it. But we're saying that he has it. We're declaring that. So being a part of the praise band or being a part of the sound team, all of that stuff is an important thing. And I'll tell you why I'm so passionate about it is because, number one, I've been playing music since I was about 9 or 10 years old. I played in some bands, and I've worked at church doing sound stuff since about 2002. I started playing at church before that when I was in school, but I've been on staff at a church since 2002 and have always had something to do with sound stuff, or whether that's installing sound equipment, helping lead worship. Nearly every church I've been at, all but one, I've reinstalled all the sound equipment and bought all new stuff because I'm a gear nerd and I like that stuff, number one. But number two, the way I view the sound team specifically and the band is some people come in here and they're looking for a reason not to worship. Some people come in and they want to critique. They want to say, well, that sounded bad, or oh, well, they had buzzing here, or oh, they missed a note there, or oh, the worship pastor forgot the words, or whatever it is. They're looking for something to complain about. I think most people who come into worship are not, but some people are. So, number one, our goal is to not give them a reason to have something to complain about, right? People are going to come in and complain about things anyway. But we don't want to pile onto that because we're giving subpar effort or subpar equipment. Now, I know we all have budgets, believe me. We're looking at new sound and lighting stuff, mainly lighting and a little bit of sound stuff. Oh, man, if it was no budget, I have some ideas of what we would do at our church, right? I'm sure, and y'all do too. You're like, oh, if we could do anything, I want this. We were talking a minute ago about what happens if you outgrow this building. Well, if there's no budget constraints, oh yeah, y'all could do some really good things, but we all have those constraints. But within our budget, we want to offer the best thing that we can. We want to have the best equipment that we can. We want to offer the best service that we can. We want to have the best musicians that we can, as long as they have a heart for worship, because number one, we don't want to give excuses for people, because they're going to come up with excuses anyway, right? Number two, the Bible tells us to bring our best to the Lord, because he's worthy of that. So that's best if you're singing, if you're playing guitar or drums or keyboard. That's best if you're the guy running the sound stuff. That's best if you're the person doing the prayer before the offering or whatever it is. God wants our best, not just when we're in this room. He wants our best all the time, right? But we come collectively here to say we're all here to collectively give God our best, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit today about some tips, some tricks, and if you're new to sound stuff, let's pray first, and then we'll get into that. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for this time that we can come before you, and I just pray that you would just bless this time. I pray that you would just help us to all to learn a little bit together, and maybe me learn too, God, because I'm always learning new things, and I thank you for that. I thank you that you put godly people in our lives, God, that we can learn from, that we can have accountability with, God, that we can have friendship with, and I just thank you for these men that are here and their willingness to come and serve. Pray that you bless this time. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so if you have your little sheet, we're kind of just walk down some of this. There's some things that we'll talk about, we'll hit. A lot of this is stuff for you to have just as little checklists, right? And you can do tons of research online on YouTube. There's hundreds of hours of videos about y'all's board, all kind of the microphones, all kind of stuff that you can learn. But the goal here is to give you just kind of a theoretical idea of what we're trying to do with the sound stuff, and kind of some of what the band needs, maybe what the speaker needs, if Lynn or Josh or whoever's preaching, some things that we can do to help them, and maybe some things too that the band doesn't need that some of them may think they need, right? But how do we navigate that? If you're the sound guy, how can you politely say, no, I ain't doing that, right? And there's times that you may have to do that. So we're going to walk through some of that a little bit together. First, I want to just give you can look at your sheet there. There's some pictures and stuff, but I want to give you some just terminology. Okay, so on every mixer, and a lot of this stuff will be for any mixer. If y'all upgrade and don't have the Studio Live back there, mixer that you have now, this will nearly all still apply, okay? If y'all, like your portable sound system, do y'all have a mixer for it too, or? Yeah, so this will work. Is it still the Studio Live, or is it a different thing? It runs with the EV thing, doesn't it? Yeah. So this can work for that. It can work if y'all get a little mixer for when y'all do stuff outside, just to add multiple speakers or anything, and have monitors for like when y'all do the revival and stuff. If you guys are running the sound for that or piecing together sound stuff for that, this will apply to anything that you do. Okay, it's generic, but it's terminology that's important because it's terminology that's located in your board too. So this will help you understand some of that stuff. A lot of these things are once you set it, you don't really have to tweak it very much, if ever. But understanding what it does and what it is important because it helps to, it just helps you understand workflow and helps you understand what's going on. And sometimes it really helps you problem solve too. Okay, so first thing is this, gain versus volume. So there's two different things that we identify as level, mainly on any kind of board, right? So there's gain and level. So they're different. Volume level is typically, so overall volume is how loud something is, right? That's an easy definition. How loud is something? But on a board, you have two different ways to control that, okay? So you have what's called a gain knob. You have a gain for every single channel. So, you have your channels. You have a channel for the preacher's mic. You have a channel for the electric guitar, for Josh's guitar, for drums. And if y'all have one drum mic or multiple mics, whatever you have every single microphone input, anything up there has a channel, right? So gain, on every channel, there's a gain knob. So what do you do if you turn the little slider, the fader, all the way up, and it's not loud enough? what do I do? I can't go any louder. You can. But you have to be careful because there's a thing called gain, and gain, what the slider does and what gain does, they're different because, so I should have got like a whiteboard, but I didn't, but I can do this with my hand. So gain, imagine you have like a piece of rope, right? So you have a 10-foot piece of rope. So you hang the rope up straight up and down from the ceiling, floor to ceiling. It's 10 feet long, and you want to measure how long it is, right? So what gain is, let's say you take a piece of red tape and you stick it anywhere on that rope. So you stick it at 5 feet, okay? So gain is pretty much the highest you can go, okay? You're setting a threshold of, I'm not going any higher than this red piece of tape. Now, when I use my slider, right, the highest I can go is the red piece of tape. So if the overall volume I have is all the way to the ceiling, right, gain controls that. But I'm saying that I don't want to get above the red tape, right? Because I may have feedback, I may have weird sounds that may get distorted and get kind of, crunchy a little bit. I don't want that in most of our instruments. So I want it to be clear. So I'm going to put this red piece of tape here because this is kind of, I think, the highest I should probably ever get, the loudest I should probably ever get with this microphone, right? Let's say that you, on a normal Sunday, y'all have it set at right here at 5. You got your red tape here on nearly all the channels. They don't have to be the same on every one because microphones and guitars and inputs are different. But let's just say you have your red tape set, but now you have a band come in. And you're like, we can get away with making it a little bit louder today on the electric guitar and the drums because they won't blame us. They'll blame the band, right? Because they're not from here. But we know we need it to be rocking today, right? So what we can do is if maybe, say the electric guitar we want a little bit louder, but we're kind of already at that peak on our fader, we can go to gain and bring it up just a hair, right? So maybe instead of 5 feet off the ground, our red tape is 6 feet off the ground. So we have a little bit more range to play with. What we don't want to do is use the gain as our volume on a regular basis, right? The gain is something we want to leave set for the most part and not mess with. The reason is if any of you have ever been around guitars or play electric guitars like amplifiers, so nearly all amplifiers have a gain and a volume knob, right? So what gain does, if you ever hear like distortion, like the grunge sound guitar, the grungy sound stuff, which nearly everybody plays with at least a little bit, what that comes from is you turn the gain up, and as the gain gets louder, it starts to distort. It starts to overload the preamp that's in there, the thing that warms up the sound and makes it sound nice and full. That can get overloaded. It's called overdrive, right? Because you overdrive that preamp, and it starts to distort, right? Now, on guitars, you want that. Sometimes in basses and stuff, you want that. You do that, and then you have this other volume knob that you bring the overall volume down because you have this sound that you've already reached because of your gain. Now, that's good for electric guitars. It's not great for singing. It's not great for acoustic. Wouldn't it sound weird if the keyboard player starts playing, How Great Thou Art, and it's dun, 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 like all distortion sounding, right? That would be weird, right? It wouldn't sound right. And so gain is something that we want to be, it's a tool that we can use, but we don't want to overuse it, right? It's not a regular thing we use. Once we get our mics typically set up, we kind of want to leave them where they are. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll talk about if we're going to set up a new channel, what will we do, what steps will we do? We'll look at that in a minute. Another thing is I want you to understand, and this may be a thing for Josh to think about too. It's something that we're thinking about currently, and it's been something I've been trying to really push for years now. And when you see all these huge like worship bands, like if just name one, Elevation or Bethel or whoever, a lot of these people whose songs you may sing at church, you'll typically see like 10 people with a microphone on the stage, right? Like 10 people singing. It's like, wait a minute, I can't even tell that guy's lead singing, and I can't even differentiate any of these other people. Why are they even up there? Well, here's why. So typically what you have is you have lead vocals, you have harmony vocals, and we know what that is because y'all do that some at church. You'll have somebody singing a different part, right, that goes along with it. There's another thing called gang vocals. So it's like a prison gang, right? No, it's not that. But gang vocals means just a group, right, a gang. So gang vocals are people who, they can sing harmony, melody, whatever it is, but they're typically the ones who, like, you want to hear the harmony part specifically, not as loud as the lead, but you want to hear that microphone. The gang vocals, it's kind of a thing that developed from the old school choirs, right? So back in the day, right, if you've been in church a while, you probably remember that. And some churches, a lot of churches still do that. We'll have a choir, right? Now in the choir, I've been in churches who that's very powerful sopranos who you always hear above everybody else. But the goal of a choir is you don't necessarily hear any one singer when they're singing, right? Unless it's a solo. You just hear the parts, right? You hear all the parts. And that's kind of what gang vocals are. They're the parts that just add fullness to the sound behind the singers. So I know when y'all sing, how many people do y'all usually have sing on the microphone? Like 3 or 4 people. So there may be times where it's hard to hear 1 or 2 of those, right? And there may be times where those people get frustrated, like, well, my husband says he can't even hear me when I'm singing out there. He could barely hear me, right? We all have a place. There's a point for all of us being up there. And we can lead in worship even if nobody hears us, right? Because people look at the people on the stage. Should they be looking at us for worship? No. But part of a worship leader or lead worshiper, which everyone who's part of this, including you guys, are part of that team, right? Part of what we do is we're a visual representation of what it means to worship. And for some people that come in, they've got worship down as far as coming in and their heart is right, they're ready, and they're just excited about it every week. Some people need a little cattle prod, need a little direction, and have to be shown how to do it. And the people on the stage, the people that are seen, that's their job, right? If everybody's standing there like this and singing, telling, how great is our God, sing with me, how great is our God, are we projecting that we think God's great if we're singing like this? How great is our God, how great? We're not, right? So as much as worship is bringing these, singing about God's attributes and who he is, it's also leading other people. Chris Tomlin wrote a book several years, probably 10 or 15 years ago, called Arriving. Everybody probably knows who Chris Tomlin is, but in it, it's kind of his autobiography. And one of the things he talked about was for years and years, when he first started leading worship, he was leading a breakaway at A&M, which is a college deal that Louis Giglio was associated with, who does Passion. And that's how they kind of got together. And when he started, he would lead worship and he would close his eyes because he would say, I would look out and I would see people goofing off or people whispering or people telling jokes during the worship. And I didn't want to see that. So I didn't want to lose my focus because they weren't worshiping. So I just closed my eyes and not look at anybody else. And like, I'm going to worship and I hope y'all join me, right? But then he said it took years, but after a while, I got convicted about that. And I thought, look, my job is not to worship myself and hope they join me. My job is to lead them into a time of worship. Right? And my job is to lead them into God's presence. And I can't do that if I can't see him. Right? If I look out at the congregation and I realize, man, they just don't get it. Their hearts aren't right today. Something's not right. He said, I may have to stop and say, look, we're going to stop right now, and we're going to have some people talk about what they're thankful for. Because when we understand who God is and what he's done, our response is worship. So maybe we need to have a reminder about who God is and what he's done so that it pulls us all together into an attitude of worship, because we're just not ready yet, right? But if I have my eyes closed the whole time and I'm not listening to them, all I'm listening to is my in-ears and I don't see anything else, I don't know that. My job here isn't, I can worship myself. My job here isn't for me to worship myself. My job is to lead everyone else too. Right? You guys are a part of that. So lead vocals, harmony vocals, gang vocals, we all have a part in that to play. And there's some more definition stuff in there you can read. I want to talk a little bit, since we're talking about some definition stuff, about EQ. And I know you all have a subwoofer up there, so we're going to talk a little bit about this because it's an important thing to understand. Because when you guys, EQ is equalization, and that's you have that in your car. Anybody got subs in their car? Have you got any subs? Oh, yeah. Like the boom down the road? Yeah. So if you notice, when somebody drives by, right, if they have subs in their car, and it's booming, 90% of the time, you can't hear any words that the singer, rapper, singer, whoever they are, you can't hear what they're saying, right? You can't understand that, but you can hear the bass. So look at your little, under sound waves. We'll skip the first part up there, but look under sound waves. I put a picture on there for you. So amplitude and time are what are the two ways we measure sound, right? That's how we really measure what sound is. And if you look at those, the high frequency, medium, and low frequency, look at how long it takes for one sound wave to develop in a high frequency. It's pretty short, right? It happens really fast. Now look at the medium. So this is highs, mids, and lows pretty much. And you could do high mids and mid lows and full EQ stuff if you want to, but we're just going to look at these three things. So highs, when you produce it, the way to think about it is this. The same number of waves are pretty much going to be produced, but what we have to think about is, with high, mids, and lows, let's say 100 waves are going to be produced. Well, how long will it take to get 100 high-frequency waves? This amount of time. How much time will it take to get 100 mid waves? Twice as long. How long will it take to get 100 low waves? A lot longer. So if I play guitar and I'll play it and it's going to make 100 waves of sound, and then it's going to dissipate to where you can't hear it anymore, those highs are going to happen really fast. Those mids are going to go further, and those lows are going to go way far. That's why when you're outside with the sub, we've got some stained glass in here. Windows might rattle a little bit. Why is that? Because those waves are big waves. And think about it that way. Think about if you're at the ocean, you got a bunch of little fast ripples. Those are cool. They're not going to knock you down. You got some bigger waves, fun to jump up and down in, right? And then you got the big waves that are going to that you're going to surf on, or they're going to knock you over and you're going to be rolled up and look silly on the beach, right? Those are the bass waves. That's why they rattle windows. Highs don't rattle windows. Mids don't. It's the bass waves. So we don't care as much about the windows rattling. I know that's something people are like, the windows are rattling, it's too loud. Just turn it up more. You won't hear the rattling. Just play it. But it's something to consider, though, because those bass waves are bigger, right? So, and another thing is, because of those bigger waves, some instruments, and we'll talk about this when we talk about instruments in just a minute, some of those bigger waves are what cause a lot of feedback problems. So feedback, and there's different types. There's and then there's right? So that really low sound where it starts feeding back and you can't control it, those are those bass waves that are just bouncing all over the room and coming back into the microphone. Okay, what that is what feedback is sound waves that come through the microphone, come out through the speakers, and then come back through the microphone. They're being recycled over and over again. And because of that, when you start to get a little feedback, it starts getting louder and louder. Why? Because you have a little bit that's coming through, and then it's getting reproduced through the amps and the speakers and coming through again and again and again. And that's why it doesn't just go boop, right? It's like boop, and it builds. Because every time it cycles through the system, it gets louder and louder. So we have to be careful with certain instruments, especially, and with vocal mics, about bass, right? And we'll talk about that in just a minute pretty quickly when we look through different instruments. Bass, mids, and highs. There's a little chart there that talks about pretty much everything that we know that are frequencies that we can detect with technology. And it goes from 0 up to about 20,000 hertz. And you see that on there. I think it stops. You don't see the little arrow coming up at the end, but it stops right at 20,000. That's the 20,000 is the high end of what the human ear can hear, right? So really, we don't need to concern ourselves with below 20 or over 20,000. We just need to know that from 20 to 20,000 is what we can hear. And from 20 to about 200 or 250 is where all the subwoofers happening, right? I'm assuming that subwoofer has a crossover in it probably. And so what a crossover, is it powered? Does it have an amp in the back? All right, so it probably has a crossover. Most of them do. If not, you have a crossover on there. So what a crossover does is it takes right there that 200 hertz or 250, and it puts a limit here, and it says, I'm not letting anything anything higher frequency than this come through the speaker. So if you notice, if like you have somebody singing high soprano, you put your ear down there by that subwoofer, you won't hear hardly anything, like nothing at all. Maybe really faint because it's coming through some low frequency stuff coming through other microphones, but you won't hardly hear it, but you'll hear it out of the mains. And then the bass player plays, and it's rumbling up there and just barely coming out of the mains. Well, why is that? Because that crossover is set where the bass frequencies from the bass guitar and the kick drum and stuff like that, you have that driving, that pushing out of that sub because they're in that frequency range, but nothing else gets to come through there. Right? And with a sub, one of the things we like to do is we like to put a crossover where it doesn't allow some of those things to come out of the main speakers because it takes so much more energy to produce that big wave, right? Like as far as amps from your amplifiers, that we don't want to blow our fancy, expensive speakers. So sometimes we'll bring that down where not as much comes out of that because we have a sub dedicated to that. Have you ever had like a system, if you have a sub in your car, if you have like those systems in your house, like a stereo surround system or something like that, surround sound. A lot of times, especially, I had one when I was in high school, and I thought it was the coolest thing. It was all wired, and I had it in my bedroom, and there were wires, like, stapled to the wall, and I had them hanging, on nails and across the room. And it had the little subwoofer by the TV, right? Well, those other speakers were like this big. They were tiny. They couldn't make hardly any sound, but they didn't have to because they're doing highs. It doesn't take a lot of power, electricity to make highs. But it takes a lot to make the lows because they're such big waves, right? So now you know why you have a sub. It's not just because it sounds cool. It's because it actually helps the whole system sound better. So when it's time to buy a new one or add a second one, if you ever want to do that, or outside, when you're doing stuff outside, of course, your EV thing has sub built in, right? Has the sub on the bottom. But that's why something like that is so cool and so important to have, and it's better than just having a regular speaker because it's got something dedicated to that really power-hungry thing of low frequency, right? So a couple more definitions, and we're going to get into specific instruments, and then we'll go up there and look at the mixer a little bit. So compression is something that's important too. So compression and gate are two things that are not used a lot in churches, but are very important tools that we can use. Don't have to, but we can. So we'll talk about that a little bit. How many of y'all have ever had somebody you've heard somebody who they're singing or they're playing the guitar or playing the drums, and everything's pretty level, and then all of a sudden it's like, la, 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 la. It's like super loud. Like, oh, golly, where'd that come from? Maybe it's one note on the guitar that's like, super loud, right? So what a compressor does is a compressor takes that high part, the loudest, say this is your low volume, high volume. Right? And when you look on pretty sure your board has this, when you go to the compressor, there's a line that looks like this. Goes from left to right. I'm doing right to left, I'm looking backwards. Goes from left to right. And when you get to the top, instead of going up here, you can make it go up here and then curve off, right? So what a compressor does is you don't want it to be super squashy, because when you have a lot of compression where it goes like this, barely goes up and then goes across, then it sounds like the singer's in a tin can, right? Now, that's a cool sound sometimes, but it's not something you want like all the time, right, on your singers. So what compression does, set right, and it should be probably on every microphone, should be just a little bit of compression, right? And on drums, anything that's not like acoustic, you can have a little bit. On mics, you can have a little bit. The keyboard, you could probably have a little bit. The drums, you can have a little. Electric guitar is one of the only things we don't really put compression on, and we'll talk about that in a minute why we don't do that. But what compression is, it just says, okay, this is kind of the limit of the loudness, right? I've got the volume set, and most of the time the volume sounds perfect. But every now and then, if they get the mic a little too close, or if they sneeze into the mic, or if they cough into the mic, or if the guitar player hits one note that's a little bit too loud, or the drummer plays a little too hard on that deal, right? It levels it out. It says, okay, this is the normal volume. It's right here. But every now and then they get up here, and I don't want them to get above this point. You don't want to adjust the volume, because if you adjust the volume and then when they're doing their normal thing, it's not loud enough, right? So you don't want to adjust the volume and bring the volume down, because then the drummer, when he's playing normally, it's like, man, the drums aren't loud enough, right? You want to leave the volume the same. You just want to take off those extra high things where they hit a little bit too hard and just make it where it's all even, right? So that's what, and it's a kind of a more professional kind of thing to do, but y'all have it, might as well use it, right? And with the live stream, it's important too, because sometimes in a live stream, it may sound one way in here, and it sounds different at home, and you may not notice it as much in here, but in a live stream, if they have their headphones in, maybe that thing is like piercing, right? Because they've got it, because people are listening to your live stream while they work out, because it just pumps them up, right? I don't know if that's the case or not, but I listen to ours when I'm at the gym, so I mean, whatever. And I've listened to y'all's before, so we all sneak around and watch each other's services sometimes. So anyway, so compression is that. Compression is a thing that just too much can make everything sound thin and not very good. But you just want to keep, the goal of compression is keep things from peaking, right? Make the peak, instead of a pointed peak that hurts your ears, it makes it kind of rounded and smooth a little bit, okay? Gate is the exact opposite. Where compression is squashing anything that gets a little too high, gate, imagine the same thing, right? What gate does, here's your low volume. What gate does is when it gets to right here, it shuts it off. So I don't know if Jimmy's ever had this, but have you ever been to a concert or been to church or anything like that, and there's a guitar player, and then when they're not playing, you hear like a bzzz, you hear that buzz, right? And then maybe they put their hands on the strings, and bzzz, 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 you can hear that buzz a little bit. What gate can do is gate makes it where anything below a certain level, like buzzing, gets cut off, right? So pretty much you're closing a gate. That's why it's called that. You're closing a gate for these low volume sounds, okay? And microphones, it could be helpful. A lot of times in studios, like when people do podcasts and stuff, you'll have a little bit of that because they only want to hear each other through their microphones, right? So like what gate does, let's say like on a stage like this, what you don't want is, like you may not want the drums to be coming through Josh's singing mic, right? Because if they're coming through his singing mic, you can't control that. You can control the mics on the drums, but if they're coming through Josh's singing mic, the only way to control it is to turn Josh down or to turn Josh up, right? So we don't want to have that bleed over. We're going to have some because we're playing live instruments on stage, but we don't want to have a lot of it. We can control some of that. And what it does is if you come up and you just whisper, if you whisper like this, if you whisper where you can barely hear, it won't come through. How many times are we whispering at church with a microphone? Doesn't happen really. And if they do, if the preacher does it like as an illustration, they're going to whisper loud like this so everybody can hear it. So what it does is it cuts some of those little bitty things off. So, we're all humans. Every now and then, you may have to back off the mic and cough, right? You back off, and do that. Some of those things won't come through the live stream, and they won't come out over the speakers. So if I'm singing and I'm, singing a song, and I'm la 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 la, everybody's going to hear that, right? On the live stream and in the sanctuary, everybody's going to hear those sounds. But if I back off, I may not hear it here. In the live stream, you may still hear it, but you don't if you have a gate, right? You have these two tools that take the low stuff off and take the really loud stuff off that are just the ambient noises we don't want, right? That's what a gate is. So look at a little bit of specific instruments, and then we'll talk about some. When we talk about adding new instruments and mics, we'll go up there and we'll look at y'all's board and talk for a minute about some of the stuff specifically on y'all's board that you need to know. Yes. Yes, no. So a lot of compressors are called compressor limiters. So the idea of a compression is that it's a smoother kind of thing, where a limiter is like a gate, but the other way. So like a compressor, you can set up to where it has like attack and just different terminology things, but you can have it set up to where it goes like this, and then it doesn't just shut off here. It just kind of rounds up. Like, where as you get louder, and like you'll see a ratio, like 6 to 1 or 2 to 1 or whatever. What that is for every 2 decibels that I go louder, the sound's only going to go like 1 louder, right? So I can so there's a little bit of dynamics or volume pretty much inside of anything. Dynamics are the ups and downs, right, of the volume. So with a limiter, you put a limiter on it, and when you get to this level, there is 0 dynamics, right? So I can talk louder and louder and louder and louder and louder, and it won't get louder. With a compressor, I can talk louder, 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 and it won't get as loud as what it was just now, but you can hear a little bit of a difference, right? So that's why compressors are more commonly used, because a compressor still gives you a little bit of dynamic, but it's not so much that it's out of control, right? And when we look at instruments, we'll talk about that here in just a second. So right now. So we're going to go through just the instruments that I know you guys have, but it's what pretty much everybody has. So we'll talk about that for a little bit. So with vocal mics, compression is something to consider on every vocal mic, every singing mic, right? Because a little bit of compression smooths things out, makes everything consistent, right? There's no super high peaks of volume, and it kind of sweetens the sound a little bit when you have a little bit of compression. When you get into those high ranges, when you're singing loud, just a little bit kind of helps smooth it all out. So that's a good thing. Reverb and delay, you guys probably don't use delay very much. We don't use it hardly ever. We've used it a few times on a couple songs, but it can get really muddy really quick with reverb and delay. So delay is the dut, 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 where reverb is just the sound of stuff bouncing off a wall in a room, right? Reverb is more just adds some fullness to your sound, where delay is that dut, 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 like you hear on guitars sometimes where they'll play a lead line of versus like that's the difference between delay and reverb. So delay you won't use much, but a little bit of reverb on every vocal mic, like singing mic, is not a bad thing. So a little bit of reverb can be good because it makes it just sound a little more professional, right? Especially I can hear there's not a lot of reverb, but hey, you hear it went on just a little bit, just for like a split second. That's reverb. It's the sound of something bouncing off the walls. And on y'all's deal, you'll probably have a small room that's going to sound more like that, or a medium-sized room, or you have a hall, which is a bigger room. Cathedral is what's used sometimes, which is like a really big reverb. And then inside of each one of those, you can adjust how much you have. So a little bit of like a hall reverb or something like that for vocal mics is good because it gives some space. And in the room, you don't notice you need it, but on the live stream, have you ever listened to the live stream and everything's just dry? Like, it doesn't sound as good as when you're in the room, right? Like, live is always better. Well, one of the reasons live is better is because you have these dynamics, and reverb's kind of one of these, of stuff bouncing off the walls. As much as we think that's a bad thing, it's kind of good because we get, like, every direction we have sound hitting us, right? Because it's bouncing off the walls, and we get kind of a 3D sense of the music and of the room. But on live stream, a lot of times we don't have that. It's just dry. But if you put a little bit of reverb on most of your instruments and all of your vocal mics, you hear a little bit of that room sound. It's not maybe this room, but it's a room. So it gives some 3D quality to the sound, and it makes it sound more professional and sound a little better. So EQ and a high-pass filter. So there's two different ways that traditionally this has been called a low cut or high pass. So what high pass filters are, or low cuts, is low cut does what it does. It cuts low frequencies, those sub frequencies we were talking about on that picture that you had on the first page. It cuts those out. High pass does the same thing, but it doesn't cut those out. It only allows the higher frequency things to pass through. It's the same thing, but it's kind of, they're titling it something different. Low cut cuts the lows. High pass only allows the higher frequencies to pass. Okay, so a lot of places have a high cut or a low cut. So like a lot of small mixers, old school mixers, on each channel you might have a high cut and low cut. So like on a bass, you do a high cut, where you don't get the high stuff, right? So it's kind of like a cheap and easy way of almost doing a crossover for a subwoofer, because you just cut out all that stuff, cut out all the high stuff. But then like vocal microphones, how often are we going to be singing as low as what the bass guitar will go? Never, unless you're Johnny Cash. You can go pretty low, but most of us don't. I mean, we don't do that. And the mics start getting those big bass waves and start doing that feeding back when we get a lot of those lows. So a high-pass filter or a low-cut filter is a good thing for vocal mics, because we don't use those frequencies. They're not vocal frequencies. So we can cut those things out or high-pass them to where only the highs get to come through. A low-pass is the same thing. It only allows the low stuff through, okay? So like a bass drum, you might could want to do that. I'd say probably not. Bass guitar, you could. Bass, we'll talk about that in a second when we get to drums. But EQ, so EQ is your highs, mids, lows. And we talked about that on vocal mics, you don't want a lot of lows, but you also don't want it to sound like tinny. You want it to sound full. And so with different microphones, with different rooms, you kind of have to just do that by ear. But these are things that once you have it adjusted, you don't have to adjust it a whole lot anymore. Right? Volume is mainly what we're adjusting on a Sunday to Sunday basis, because y'all are going to have the same, more than likely the same instruments, maybe not every week, but the same, on a regular basis, the same instruments, probably the same microphones, right? More than likely, same or similar vocalists using those microphones. So if I've got a lady using a microphone one week and a different lady using a microphone the next week, if their voices are similar in range, I probably don't need to adjust any of the EQ stuff. I may just need to adjust the volume if this one sings louder than that one, right? I may need to adjust that, but I don't need to adjust any of the EQ stuff. But when I first set it up, their microphone, I need to. Now, y'all's mixer is pretty cool, because it has some like presets you can use, right? Doesn't it have like male, female vocal, acoustic guitar, whatever? And I think y'all have it set up that way, right? At least as the bass line. Kind of started there and then tweaked it some. Isn't that what y'all done, Jonathan? I thought that was right. So the one time I've been here and messed with it a little bit, I thought that it was that way. So it's pretty cool, because PreSonus has built in like kind of this traditional acoustic guitar EQ. Like, okay, they probably want a little bit of highs and some mids. They don't want a lot of lows. Maybe even a mid boost, so that get some of those sounds out, but we don't want it to feed back. So we're gonna preset this, and then they can tweak it as they want to. And y'all's has that. So everything is pretty much EQ-wise is preset for this one. But if you're ever mixing outside or mixing with something besides that one, or different digital mixer or any kind of mixer that doesn't have the presets, now you know. Vocal mics, you want some lows down a little bit. Mids and highs you can mess with, but you don't want a lot of lows, okay? You want some, but not a lot. Placement for vocalists. So here's the thing. And Jonathan, you're back there nearly every week, right? So, and Josh, you're leading every week. So this is something that I know we struggle with, and I think a lot of churches struggle with, is that, let's say you're singing one song and you're lead, right? So whose mic who should we hear more than anybody else? You, right? Should we hear the lady singing harmony more than you? No. Because the people in the congregation, some may want to sing harmony, but for the most part, most people aren't trained to pick out harmony parts. Right? They may hear her and sing with her. Some of the ladies may, if the song's too high or too whatever, but most of them aren't. They're going to sing the melody, right? The melody is the main notes of the song that you hear on the radio, or that you hear when you sing, or that are written as the melody of the song. Right? Amazing Grace would be, Amazing Grace. Now I could go up and say, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. That's not the melody. That's a harmony, right? But Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound is the melody. That should be the loudest part, because that's what most of the congregation needs to hear, because that's what they're singing along with. So Josh's mic, or whoever the leader is, needs to be louder. But Jonathan, tell me this. How hard is it if Josh is leading one song, and now he's singing harmony on the next song, and this lady's singing lead? How hard is it to go, okay, I need to tweak this one and tweak this one. Okay, now we're done. I need to tweak this one and tweak this one. Right? And sometimes you just forget, right? You forget to do that until you're like midway through the song and like, oh, yeah, she's too loud and he's not loud enough, right? what singers can do, and this is where you guys can come in handy, because sometimes they're like, hey, I need to be louder, or they're too loud. Instead of taking their volume away or giving them more volume, this is really handy. Do you hear how loud this is? Do you hear how loud it is now? You hear how loud it is? You hear how loud it is now? Still coming through. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. It's like 2 inches. And it's totally different, right? So what we do is we have, Heather's one of our singers. And Heather has a country kind of voice. And she sings, like her range is similar to mine. Like she has a low for a female, awesome sounding country style voice, right? We do like that Anna Wilson song, My Jesus. And she sings it. She does little country runs in it and all that stuff, right? Heather is great. She's been singing since she was a little kid. Her dad traveled and was in a band, and they traveled Ace High Band for years. They went and played. He's been playing since he was a kid, and he's been playing guitar for 50 years, right? So her whole life growing up, she went and sang with her dad. She is very good at knowing that if I'm leading, I'm going to have the mic here, and when I hit a really high note, don't even need the compressor because I'm going to bring it out when I get louder and bring it back in. She's very good at that. But also, when she's not leading and not singing any harmony, she'll just keep the mic right here. She naturally does the gang vocal thing, right? The behind the scenes, give some fullness vocal thing, because she knows I'm not lead. I don't care if they can pick out my part. It doesn't matter to me. My job's not to be lead on this. My job is to add some filler and to assist these other people in worshiping by them seeing me worship. Right? That's my job on the song. Not even to be heard, just to be some filler and to be here to help lead worship. Right? Did Jonathan have to do anything to change the volume right here? Is he doing anything back? He's looking right at me and he's shaking his head no from the sound booth, right? He's not doing anything. Now, it takes a little bit of practice to know how much to come off, right? So with ours, I sing lead probably over half the time. And Christina sings lead some, and then we have a guy named Jared that sings lead some, and then we have Heather sings lead some. They don't have to tweak my mic a whole lot because when I'm usually singing harmony or lead or just not singing. So when I'm singing lead, I'm nearly eating the mic. I'm right here. When I'm singing harmony, I try to be like 2 inches further away. And I'm playing guitar too, so there's times that I'm getting a little bit closer, but we've got a compressor. So I'm not going to get too loud, right? The compressor's going to take care of that if I get too close. But I'm going to back off a little bit when I'm singing harmony because I don't want to overshadow the melody because that's not my goal. My goal is not to be the main thing heard at this point, right? My goal is to be kind of some background filler. So your singers can help a lot when they understand some mic placement and understand that what their role is and their job is. If their job is leading, eat that mic and you're probably not going to share it with anybody else anyway, and if you do, get some alcohol preps and wipe it off because you're going to slobber all over it anyway. But that's fine. Get it close if you want to, or however close they're comfortable, they usually sing with it at. But then when they're singing harmony, maybe back off an inch or so, and if they're singing gang vocals, bring it down, right? If they're not lead and they're not harmony, they're singing the melody but just kind of in the background. And that's the good thing about having, that's why it's serving in a position of leadership, like as far as being on the praise team or working in the sound booth. We're serving because it's not about us. We're serving because we're here to serve the church and serve the needs of the congregation and the needs of the worship team and the needs of the community, all these things as far as music goes, because it's not about us. We're here to make sure that everything goes off as well as it can, that there's not distractions, that we don't do anything dumb where when people leave church, all they say is, man, that was one bad note, wasn't it? Or whatever. Our goal is to make sure that when they leave, the people have worshiped, right? And we haven't given them excuses not to. That's my deal in worship. That's why I want to offer the best, because if we offer the best, even the people who are maybe lost who come in here, they don't come in and say, man, that stunk, right? Because we know there's lost people that are coming to your church every week. There's people who aren't Christians. Their attitude may not be about worshiping God. Their attitude may be, man, that music sounded good. Man, I like that. They've got drums in church or they've got whatever. I like that. I may go back. Right? Is that our goal in worship? No, our goal is to worship God. But we have to be considerate of the fact that there's people who come in here, their idea of worship is totally different than ours. They don't get it. because they're not Christians. They don't know who God is and what he's done. So we want them to be in here as much as they can so that they can come to know Jesus, and we don't want our music to be a turnoff for them not coming back, right? So vocal mics are important. We'll real quickly run through some other instruments. Speaking mic, you don't want any spatial effects on like the preaching mic. Spatial means space, right? So reverb, delay, all that stuff. You don't really want that on your speaking mics. It can sound just like a podcast, or it can sound just like because you want it really clear, right? So you don't want any of that stuff. You can put a little compression on there. I don't think your dad is much of a yeller, but he probably can get a little riled up sometimes. Cody, our pastor, can get very loud, right? Like, it's just how he is. He's very dynamic in his whispering to loud and yelling, right? And so when Cody is up there, one of the things that we do, we have a little bit of compression on his mic because for that reason, he may get a little too loud, and we don't want him to like bust people's eardrums. So when he's up there, we specifically have a little bit of compression on the lapel mic that he's wearing, right, the headset mic. So EQ, the same things as a vocal mic. You don't want it to be boomy and bassy. You want it to be crisp and clear. You could even get away with being, if you're having problems with frequencies like feeding back, you can make it a little more high if you have to, because if it's just extra crisp, nobody's going to complain about that. If it's extra boomy and bassy and it's feeding back and nobody can understand them, they will complain about that, okay? So there's some mic stuff. Bass. So when you have a bass player up there, you have a bass player, right? So when you have a bass, the low-pass filter is something you can think about, like we talked about, or a high cut, right, where you only want the low-frequency stuff coming out. But don't be afraid to have a little bit of high-frequency stuff, because the bass can be low, but the bass also has some high notes up there. And when you get to the high end of a 4-string bass, because when you add strings like a 5-string, you're adding more lower notes. You're adding a B string to the bottom. You're not going higher on the top. So when you get to the top, though, of that G string, I know I said G string in church, right? I had a guy I was playing one time, and I was actually playing, and it was at a church, and broke a string, and I was like, all right, so I had the other guys kind of do like some ambient like stuff, like, hey, I broke a string, I'm going to go get the other guitar real quick. So I was like, man, I'm just going to tell him, I broke a string. Let me change guitars real quick. And the guy running sound in the back said, I hope you didn't break your G string. That made it really awkward at a church environment, right? So sound guy, don't do that. If y'all are back here running sound, don't holler things to the front or in the middle of it, especially inappropriate things. But a bass, that high G string right there, you get some things where it's maybe not in that low frequency range. It may be getting up high where it's going to come out these speakers. Don't be afraid to leave some of those highs in and just kind of EQ it. Maybe turn the bass up a little bit, the lows up a little bit, and the mids kind of mid-range, and the highs down, but not all the way off, right? Because they can do some high stuff that may sound good too. So something to think about. You can do that, but you don't have to, the low-pass thing. EQ, we just talked about that, kind of how to set it. With your lows a little bit higher, mids around midpoint, highs maybe a little lower. And then effects, a little bit of reverb on bass is not bad either. You can do a little bit of compression on there too. A lot of this depends on how you're playing. If you have somebody who's playing through an amplifier, you may not need to do much compression. If they're playing through an amplifier and then have a microphone in front or have a direct out into your system, because the preamp in there, remember we talked about the overdrive thing with the electric guitar amplifier and how it kind of starts crunching, more distortion and crunching as you turn that gain up? Well, that preamp in a bass amplifier does the same thing. So if you're playing through an amplifier, you're automatically going to have compression, because that's what's happening. When you start getting distortion, you start getting, what's happening is the sound is distorting and compressing and pushing down, right? So you have that naturally in a bass amplifier and an electric guitar amp. Now, a lot of people add extra to that. It makes the note last longer. It adds sustain, but you get some of that naturally. So you may not have to do it. But if you're playing straight into the house, just like straight into a direct box and not through a board or anything that has an amp simulator, we're getting all into the tech, gear nerd technology stuff here. But anybody who's not playing through an amplifier or an amp simulator, you might want to put a little bit of compression on, right? Because all you're going to they can play louder and it can get too loud sometimes. Right? Or they may accidentally hit the pickup, the thing that picks up the sound. You could touch that with your finger, or if you hit it too hard, hit the string, it could bounce off of it, and it's a loud, uncomfortable sounding pop, and you don't want that. But the compressor can kind of cover that up. So electric guitar, we talked about that a little bit. We're talking about keyboard too along with this. I'm going to go ahead and put these two together because usually electric guitar and keyboard are the two lead instruments. So I know Jimmy, I've heard y'all's, sir, I know when y'all have, I don't know who plays keyboard. Not about right now. When you have a keyboard player, or when you have Jimmy playing electric, or whoever's playing electric, that's usually the lead. Like they're the ones who do those little lines, you know, that play those little melody things in between singing maybe, or even on top, even along with the singing right below it. And so, but you don't want them both doing it all the time, right? Because then you don't have that fullness of the chord and playing along with Josh and the bass, with acoustic and bass. So you kind of want to have an idea of who's playing lead and who's playing fill. So that's written on both of those. And it may be different for different songs, but you kind of want to keep that in mind. You don't want them walking all over each other. And the other thing, too, is keyboard and guitar kind of fit the same space on the dynamic EQ frequency. So think about it like this. When you want to have a sound that goes from here to here, and every instrument and every mic fits somewhere on this. You want the people to be hit with a wall of sound. You don't want a partition wall, right? You don't want a fence, like a 5-foot fence. You want a full 8-foot wall so they hear the full, from lows to highs and everything in between. The problem is let's say I've built my wall, and instead of layering my wall, let's say I put a bunch of stuff here, and then I have a gap, and a bunch of stuff here, and then a gap. Are they going to be hit by a full wall of sound that sounds good, high to low, if I have everything here and then a big gap and everything here? No, right? They're just going to get hit by parts of sound. But the mids are missing, the really high stuff's missing, maybe some of the bass is missing, right? It just doesn't sound as good. When you go to the movie theater, why is it more fun to watch movies? Popcorn and candy, of course, right? But one of the reasons it's more fun to watch movies in the movie theater is because it sounds awesome, right? The music, when the car drives by, you know, you hear the sound from right to left or left to right. When an explosion happens, your bottom shakes, everything moves, right? It sounds better. Why is that? Because they spent a ton of money making sure that they cover every bit of the frequency range from highs to lows, right? So we know that we can do that. We know that y'all sound system will do that. Y'all have good main speakers, you've got a good subwoofer, you've got a great board. You can do it. We just have to make sure that everything is in there. So your sub, your bass drum are going to be down here. Your keyboard can go pretty low, right, if you want it to. But you have to remember keyboard and electric kind of sit around the same area. So maybe you EQ one of them a little more low and one a little more mid. Or one's maybe everything set right here. And then maybe the other ones you have like a mid-range push and maybe a little bit of highs and maybe less lows for your electric maybe. And so when you hit the bass note on the electric guitar, it's not, but it's like, do, you know what I'm saying? Instead of the hoofing sound, you're hitting the same note, but instead of the, you're getting a do, right? But now the bass can take over the, and maybe the low keyboard can kind of get in the middle of those two. That's why when we sing, Josh and you have a vocalist here, right? Right? I don't know your name. Karen. So you sing, right? Are you and Josh, do y'all sing the exact same notes all the time? Do you sing higher than Josh? When you did, yeah. And hit harmony, right? It's more fun when you have some harmony, right? It just sounds better. Why is that? Because you're hitting them with a wall of sound. You're saying you're going to have a vocal here, you're going to have a vocal here. 3-part harmony is awesome because you have a full wall of sound, of vocal sound hitting people. Guitars and keyboards and all that stuff's the same. And acoustic has its own place. Acoustic, when you're playing by yourself, you may want to have a little more low in it and a little more mids. But when you're playing with a full band, you know, Josh, all you're going to hear when you have an electric playing and a keyboard, you're just kind of going to hear the clackety-clack of the acoustic, right? You'll hear a little bit of the notes, but mainly you're hearing the rhythm of the acoustic along with the drums, with the cymbals, or with the hi-hats and stuff. You're hearing that rhythm, the tick-tick-tick-tick is mainly what you hear. You don't have to have a lot of lows. You don't have to have, you can have a little bit of mids, a little bit of highs. You don't need a lot of lows because when the band's playing, you're not going to notice it. If you're playing by yourself, maybe you have a little bit more of that because there's nobody else playing with you. So you want to cover more of that wall of sound with your acoustic. So if you're in here on a Sunday night or a Wednesday night, or you're doing an acoustic set, you know, maybe y'all look at EQ and Josh's acoustic a little bit differently if he doesn't have everybody else with him. If there's no bass, or like if there's no bass guitar, maybe you bring a little more lows into the keyboard that day, right? If there's no keyboard, maybe you bring a little bit more mids and highs into the bass and bring the electric, give the electric a little more lows so you can cover some of that range that the keyboard's not filling. The more instruments you have, the more you can kind of tweak, and everybody's sitting in their own little spot on that wall, so you get a full wall of sound. So there's some considerations for those things. Acoustic, we kind of talked about. Look for feedback. Mids and lows are what make feedback in acoustic. Highs don't really hardly ever do it. And if you had that happen up here, you plug your guitar in and it's, and everybody's, and you maybe put your hands on the strings and it stops it, right? Same thing as we talked about with the vocal mic. You don't have a microphone there, but you have a pickup, and what's happening is that those strings start vibrating a little bit because the strings move just a little bit because of the sound in the room. People talking, right? Guitars and pianos are a little bit different because they're stringed instruments, like drums, and you'll hear it a little bit on a snare drum, but you know you can talk, and the strings start vibrating. If you hit the right frequency, the strings will start moving. The thing is that the pickup in there can hear that, right? They're so good, they can hear that. And so they start putting that, and you don't even hear a note, but they just sense the vibration. They start putting that signal through the sound system, and it comes out the speakers, and then now they have more frequency because now it's the specific frequency of the guitar that it's making of the strings, right? Because they're vibrating. So you have that same frequency that makes them vibrate coming through the speakers to make them vibrate again. And it cycles, and that's why it gets louder and louder every time it cycles through that system. Right, so maybe cut back some of the lows and keep some mids in there. You maybe give them a little bit of highs. And, of course, Josh can have, acoustics have, not all, but most of them have some EQ stuff on there, so he can adjust a lot of that stuff himself. I'm saying you won't have to do much of that, but just be mindful. If he's playing by himself and he doesn't adjust it and you notice, oh, man, it's really tinny and pingy kind of, and it's just really high, not very full sounding, that's a change you can talk about making, you know, to make it sound better. A little more full. Drums, what do y'all use for your drum mics? You have a bass drum mic? Is that it? Okay. So condenser mics are great. So these microphones are what's called cardioid microphones. So it's called cardioid because the pattern that it accepts, it won't accept much from here. But from here, it will still pick things up. This is about the same distance. You can hear it from here. And, of course, if you're watching later, you're not going to hear any of what I said, but you can hear it from the front part where the ball of the mic is, and the reason is it's called cardioid because the pattern goes like this. Turn it upside down. What shape is that? Think about cardioid, cardiac, the heart shape. It's not pointed at the bottom, it's rounded. Maybe like an apple shape, something like that. Cardioid mic, nearly every microphone that you use like this for singing are cardioid microphones, or some are called hypercardioid that just have a slightly different pattern, but they're good. They're good because they don't pick a lot of stuff up from far away. A condenser mic picks up everything, right? Now the good thing is even on y'all's live stream, the drums sound pretty good with one microphone. Right? Condenser microphones pick up a very true recording of what it actually sounds like. So some things to think about with a condenser, though, is the same thing. That bass frequency can get really, because they're very sensitive. Condenser microphones are super sensitive. Condenser microphones have to have extra power. They're so sensitive. Like these microphones, of course, these have batteries in them. But if y'all have wired microphones, a lot of people don't even have those anymore, but it's your portable system or something. You probably have some around here. Do they have to have a battery inside them to plug into the system? No. But cardioid condenser microphones do. or they have to use what's called 48-volt phantom power, which is on your board. So it sends electricity through the wire to that microphone. If you have that turned off and tap on the microphone, nothing. So if you ever are hooking up a microphone, like you'll get a new microphone, it's a condenser mic, or if you have we don't have a pulpit really, but if you ever have a pulpit mic or choir mics, or if you ever go to drums where you have the overhead mics, like the little small microphones, like what they use over drum sets, if you ever have those, you hook them up and like, man, everything's hooked up and it's not working. I'm tapping on, these other mics are working, everything's unmuted, it's just not working. Check and see if the phantom power's on. Because if you don't have the phantom power on, those have to have 48 volts of electricity running through the system to them. And some even have, like I said, have batteries in them. Most of them can work either way, but most of the ones with batteries can work without the batteries if they're plugged in. But most professional ones like this don't, like camera microphones, like the people use the big boom things on their cameras. A lot of those have batteries in them, like 2 AA's or something, or a 9-volt. So, but think about those things. You just want it to sound good, and if you have a little too much highs, the cymbals can be like piercing in your ears. So when you have one microphone, you probably want to start with everything set straight up and down for the drum set. If you need a little more sub or a little more bass drum, just bring the bass up a little bit. That's really all you can do because we're using one mic. But that's really the easiest way to do drums, though. So you have a drum set tuned really well, and I'm sure Brad has spent some time tuning this, so that's why it sounds good. But if it's tuned well, you can put one mic and it doesn't sound bad. So there's some other notes in there you can read if you want to. So other considerations before we go look at sound booth real quick, have a backup plan. You know, it's not a bad idea to have a wired mic on the back somewhere to where if somebody's battery dies in the middle of a song or middle of a service and, we were supposed to get batteries at Walmart this week and we didn't, you got a mic. Or if Lynn's mic quits working, you got one. Or if you have somebody who doesn't know anything about the sound system and they're in here and whatever, you've got a backup mic. That's not a bad thing to have. It doesn't have to be plugged in. Just have one ready that you can plug in if you need it, because they're easy. Because batteries can go bad. I don't know if you've ever had these lose sync, but that can happen. You can have a microphone that these are all synced to y'all's receivers back there, all the little things with the antennas, right? Each one of these has its own channel that it's synced to. But sometimes they can lose sync, or sometimes you can have, depending on if they're UHF or VHF, you can have different frequencies where cell phones and ham radios are running over the same frequencies. I was playing somewhere one time, and my guitar player had a wireless, guitar system, where so he could like move around and his guitar pedals and everything on the ground. But he had his wireless thing here, and then his wireless thing going into his big pedal board, and then going to an amplifier. And we were playing, and we're playing here locally in Bonham, and I was like, in between, I was like, I hear country music, and I don't know why. Where's it? And it's coming from the speakers, from the sound system. And I was like, what? So the sound guy was like, hey, no, nothing's on, man. I mean, their mics are on, but nothing. I went up and sort of walking around the stage. I noticed when I walked by, he had a half stack, so a big, amplifier, a big Marshall half stack. And I walked by, and I could hear Bonham, KFYN, old school KFYN, KFYZ, if y'all remember that, coming through the radio. It's the Bob Holliday show. That's been around a while. You know who that is. Some of you probably don't know who that is, but you could hear it coming through the guitar amplifier. And I was like, bro, you're going to have to use a wire today. So why? I was like, because we're listening to Bonham country radio coming out of your guitar amplifier, so we can't have that, right? That can happen sometimes, so just have a couple of handheld wired mics just in case. The other thing is to be flexible. So you guys, on a regular basis, will encounter things that you're like, I don't know what's happening. What's that weird sound? I don't know. Why did this do this? I don't know. Did somebody mess with the sound? Did somebody mess with the board? Why does everything move? I don't know. And you're not just being like, you don't know, right? And Josh has done this long enough, and anybody who's sang or been in stuff, there's times where stuff just doesn't work, or stuff sounds weird, or you practice something, and it's like you have no problems during practice, and then when worship starts, popping happens, or something weird happens, right? That happens We had a guy come and look at some of our sound stuff. He was installing some stuff a couple of months ago, and we're talking about having a little bit of popping, and we don't notice it when the band's playing, but every now when people are walking in, we notice it, and it happened once or twice during sermon. And he like, when did it start? And we're like, well, it started about November, December, and it's been going on. This is like in March that he came, and he's like, oh, it'll probably go away soon. Well, that doesn't help us. You know, we paid you as a consultant to come in and tell us what's going on. He's like, static electricity, because the air's so dry. He said, and it's that static electricity, when you come in, there's so many electrical things, all your sound, every single of these wires can pick up interference, electrical interference, and static electricity. You have so many people in here, and when they walk in, they're discharging static electricity, and it's making the pops. Like, how do we fix it? And he said, well, the humidifiers big enough to do a room like this are about $10,000. You'll only use it a couple months out of the year. Like, that's ridiculous. We're not doing that. You know, how much? We got to the point of talking about, you know, the little room humidifiers you put in your room when your kid is sick, or you put them when you're sick. We're like, how many of those would we have to get and put around the sanctuary? You know, and we got to about April, and it quit. So we were asking him, we're like, what do you do? And he said, I just did an install at a church in Arkansas, 3,000 seat worship center. So we would call that in Fannin County a mega church, right? He said they spent like $250,000 on their sound system. So very expensive, top of the line everything, huge stage, lights, fog machines, all that stuff. Professional kind of stuff you get when you went to a concert at American Airlines, those kind of speakers, line erased, very nice stuff. He said, we came in, installed it. They called us a week or two later. Hey, we have this weird popping. He said they went as far as all the chairs were hooked together. They had chairs, and they're metal, so they hooked them all together, and they ran wires underneath on several of the rows and drilled holes in the concrete. And you know, a ground, like when the big copper wire you drive in to your ground at your house, they drove those 6 feet down into the ground in the sanctuary, into the dirt, and grounded every row of chairs. However many rows that is for 3,000 seats. So when the people come in and sit down, it discharges electricity through the ground, still kept popping. They said, what do we do now? And he goes, nothing. Nothing you can do, right? It's been, for them, it was going to be multiple of those $10,000 things. It's like, I could do that. And they're like, okay, we'll just deal with the popping for 3 months out of the year, you know. There's times where you just have to be flexible and go with it. There's nothing you can do to fix it, and just go with it. We're all here to serve. We're here to do our best. And God is honored by our best. He's not honored by our perfection because we're not perfect, right? He's honored by our best, though. So just come in and do your best. Come in and do what the people on stage need you to do. Y'all have in-ears, so it's really, really good. Like all of our instrumentalists use in-ears, but the vocalists, 2 or 3 of our vocalists don't have in-ears in your monitors. So they still have some on the stage monitors, but they're turned down pretty low. So it's good when you have the in-ears, though, because you can give them what they need. You can make it louder. They can probably adjust it themselves. Y'all are using one mix, though. So the thing is that they're all hearing the same thing. So if Brad is sitting back there playing the drums and says, hey, I need more acoustic guitar, but everybody else, all the singers are going, there's too much acoustic guitar. It's too loud, right? You have to find that balance. And that's on you to figure that out, right? But it's on you also to tell them, for them to tell you, hey, that's too loud for me, then you have to go back and you have to find that middle ground between Brad and John, whoever it is, and say, all right, maybe, Brad, I can bring the drums down a hair, maybe I can bring the vocals down a hair and not touch Josh's guitar. Now you have the mix is better, and then you can bring your overall volume up if it's not loud enough. You can bring your volume up for your in-ears to make it louder. And if theirs is too loud, as long as we have a good mix where everybody can hear everything they need to hear, we're good, right? So those are some considerations to think about. If y'all want to, anybody's going to be working in the soundboard, let's go back there and look for just a minute and look at y'all's maybe a tight fit. Jonathan is the resident expert back here. So I may let him be the hands as we talk through this, just so you can see what he's doing. So, um, so if right now you can see everything is labeled right on y'all's board. Have y'all messed with this at all back here? Very much? Not some, a little, some, not any. Well, if you look, you can see everything's labeled. They have everything set. So you have Lynn's mic, you have instrument, you have Jimmy, you have click, right? Which the click, you know, is the beat that keeps them on beat, the track, whatever. You have all that stuff on there. You have drums, you have the computer, you have all those things. So it makes it easy because in the old days, you'd have to have a strip down here where you wrote stuff with a Sharpie or you'd have a piece of paper. Now you have everything sitting right there, okay? So if you look, a lot of those are muted, right? So one of the things that is important to know is that if that's muted, you're not going to get any sound. So when the band's playing, a lot of, like right now, Lynn's mic is muted, right? So I don't know if y'all have ever been in a church that this has happened, but sometimes you'll hear, there's a movie years ago, The Naked Gun. I don't remember all the movie. There's one part where he has a wireless microphone on and he goes to the restroom and he's in court or he's in some meeting or whatever, the mayor of Los Angeles, all this stuff. He goes to the bathroom and then you hear him singing and toilet flushing. Really embarrassing, right? You want to protect your pastor. You want to protect Brother Lynn and not make that happen, right? But you also, I mean, if he's maybe visiting, what if he's counseling somebody at the end of the service? They're coming down during the invitation and they're counseling. Does everybody else need to hear that? No, right? And sometimes Lynn may mute his body pack, right? Sometimes he may not, right? If he comes down immediately and they're walking down, and he sees them coming, he may not mute. He may just start counseling, or whoever's preaching or whatever. So that's where you need to be diligent. Whether he muted it or not, maybe go ahead and tap that mute button, right? So that they don't hear whatever sins may be being confessed or whatever things they're coming for counseling for. Everybody doesn't need to be a part of that, right? So mute's good for stuff like that. Do y'all have mute groups set up on here? So show them that. So here's your mute groups. See the bank right there? So show them what you have. Yeah. So if you just want to play music, say you've got Vacation Bible School going, or before church starts, and you just have some music going in here, people are walking in, right? Pre-service music or post-service music, but you don't want any microphones working at all. Y'all have that labeled right there, PC, where you can hit that. Everything mutes except the music for that, right? So just have that muted. Then you have band. So band mutes. See, Lynn's mic is muted. So again, we're talking about if Brother Lynn says, oh, man, I better go use the restroom before I start preaching. It just hit me right now. You don't want his microphone accidentally on when that happens, right? But you don't have to worry about it. If you have this mute group set, band, it's going to mute everything that's not a part of the band, right? So the baptistry, muted, all that stuff's muted. You're only getting what you need, so you're not going to get. The other thing is if you have say you have the baptistry mic on, it's going to pick up the drums. It's going to pick up all the sound that's going around the room and coming back. You can get feedback that way, and you could just get some weird sounds in the background. We don't want that, so y'all already have this set up. So when they're leading worship, you can do that. But then when it's time to preach, I see you have one that says Lynn. It's time to preach. Look what happens. Everything's muted except for Lynn, and that's unmuted right now because that's what I'm using, the orange mic. But everything's unmuted but him. Now, when the invitation starts, if the band comes back up to play, look what you can do. You can go to that. Now, Lynn's mic is still on, so he can talk through when they're playing and he's kind of giving the invitation maybe, and they're playing as people are coming or getting ready, or he's praying or whatever, giving the last part of the invitation. You've got him on and that, and then when Lynn's done, he's counseling people. Look what you can do. Band. Now he's off. You don't have to worry about hearing any confessed sins that we don't need to hear, right? Honestly, for you guys, that's probably the most important tool that you have is the mute. If something's going nuts, if something's feeding back really bad, right? A microphone's feeding back really bad. When we're singing, a lot of times it doesn't happen, but in between songs or whatever, a lot of times when we notice those things. But if that's happening, so look, you can see right now the only mic being used because look what you can see. See that right there? It's lighting up green. You see a couple other, the drum mic is lighting up, and the baptistry is lighting up, but it's muted. But the drum mic is lighting up. Remember what I said about it being a condenser, so it picks up everything? So it's picking up me coming through the speakers and going back into it. That's what I was talking about, that bleed over, they call it, where you have something from one mic getting picked up by another. So condenser mics do that. But like right now, the thing that's the brightest is green. So if you started, nobody's talking, but you hear one of those getting louder and louder, but you know nobody's talking, you can look on there and see which one is lighting up, and just mute that sucker. Mute it. You can go through and just kind of bring the volume down just a hair, and then unmute it. And if it doesn't do it again, you're good. And that's something y'all can come back in after the service and mess with, you know. Or you can mute it, go through your EQ, and tweak it a little bit. So right now, on that channel, on orange, you have, up there, you have the EQ. So on y'all's, it's touchscreen, right? So Jonathan can click on that 1, 2. So you have lows. You see where all my frequencies are, right? All those things are different frequencies. You see you have that curve right there, the low end frequencies. Notice there's nothing going on at the very, very bottom because my voice doesn't go that low, right? And there's nothing going on super, super high because my voice doesn't go that high. Now, if I went higher, I still can't get that high, right? And I can't get that low. But the bass, when they play the bass, you'll notice that little thing over there will light up. And if you have really high guitar notes, this thing over here will light up. But I'm right in the middle. So you see kind of the most frequency right there. So you can even look, when you have it on this deal right here, you can even look, and you can see which frequencies are the ones, because when it feeds back to, look at that. When I'm talking, it's all over the place. But when I make one specific sound, you see that? So to fix that, you can see right there where that 1 is. See, that's already marked because it could be a treble frequency. So see that? You're just bringing it down. You click on it and highlight that 1, and then that little silver knob in the middle of that master control brings that level down, right? And you can do it with all of them. If it's the high, you can do that too. I can't get that high. I can't do it. But you see what I'm saying? You can pinpoint, and you can move those things left to right a little bit too. They don't have to stay right there. They'll slide up and down, and they'll slide left to right where you can adjust where it is to find the frequency. But that right there gives you a pretty good baseline because you can cover nearly everything with those 4. Pick which one it is, bring that level down a little bit, and unmute the microphone, right? Even when it's muted, you'll still get to see that. So the other thing you probably need to know for mixing, this is what we're talking about. This is your mix. This is where you're gonna, if you need more guitar, this is where you're gonna do all that at. The main other thing you guys need to know is your monitor mix. Okay, so your monitor mix, y'all have it as mix 3. Is that right? So mix 3. So the cool thing about these, you notice everything moves when you touch it. So all the digital boards are like this. So, so y'all have your mix here, and you can adjust everything. But then here, this is what they're hearing in their headphones, right? This is what when you're playing cajon or when you're playing whatever, that's y'all's mix. So if Josh says, "Hey, could y'all give us a little bit more acoustic?" Where's acoustic at on there? So G1, guitar 1. So he could go to, if he says, "Hey, can we get a little bit more?" If you have it on main, now if you adjust it here, they're not going to get more, but everybody out here is going to get more, right? But if you go to here, you can give Josh a little bit more, a little bit less, or whoever needs what they need. You can make those changes. You won't ever hear it, but they'll hear it, right? So the main things that you guys are going to be using back here is the main mix and mix 3. Now, y'all do have, is this y'all's live stream? Okay. So that's probably pretty well going to be set most of the time, right? I'm guessing. So that's not something that you'll mess with a whole lot because that's unaffected by the room. I mean, feedback and stuff will come through, but it's unaffected by the other mixes, right? So once that's set, you're probably good for the most part on a day in to day out basis. And y'all can sit down and talk about how you do your live stream because different people do that different ways. But That's something, Jonathan, you can talk about through, because I'm sure you probably set this up. You and Josh probably went through this, but that's on mix 1 and 2. So 3 and main mix are the main things when y'all are tweaking stuff and they're asking for stuff. That's what you're going to be doing. Is mix 3? Remember, that's them, and main mix is everybody. What you're hearing. Okay. Now you can hear anything you want to hear back here with the headphones. The other thing that you probably need to know is that if you hit solo on any channel, that makes it where all you hear through the headphones is that. So right now, do you hear me at all? You do? You shouldn't. Unless something else is solo, maybe too. Mixes are automatically coming through, okay? But I wonder if you go to here and I solo it. Is it still coming through? Where you could solo? Don't worry about that then. Don't worry about that. But you have headphones though. You can hear what all the mix. You can hear what the mix is. So, in the headphones. So make sure that you're getting a good mix here. But really, you can listen to the mix here. But what you hear here is not always what you're going to hear here, right? So it's important if you guys, especially if the band is practicing, don't just sit back here. Get out and walk around. Get out and move around in the sanctuary and see what it sounds like. Because here in a room and with the headphones in, you have the ideal. Everything is perfect. There's no reverb. There's nothing bouncing off the wall. And this is the ideal world. Out here is not the ideal world, right? We have walls. We have people. We have kids screaming. We have, stuff bouncing off the walls. We have different things happening. So you need to make sure you walk around out here and make sure that what they hear is good, right? Now, it's important for what you to hear to be good because you want to worship too. But what we have to remember is when we're here, there's times that our act of worship may not be singing. It may not be lifting our hands. Our act of worship is serving to make sure that everybody else gets the opportunity to worship, right? That's why it's called serving. So there's times where maybe you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off back here trying to fix a problem or trying to, man, that's just too loud. And maybe you need to step down, even during the service. Maybe you need to step down and stand right here in the entryway or move around the back row and be like, yeah, that's just too loud, or I can't hear Karen sing, whoever. I can't hear somebody singing, or I can't hear the keyboard. Headphones sounds great out here. It doesn't sound as good. Remember, you're not mixing for yourself. You're mixing for the people in here. So make sure that they can hear and that it sounds good out there. So your act of worship, there's times you'll get to sing and everything's great. There's times where you're fixing problems and doing damage control. But that's why you're here. You're here to serve in that way. So, and I promise, having people back here that are paying attention makes his job and everybody up there's job a whole lot easier. So there's not a whole lot you really have to do. You just have to be paying attention, looking for those bad feedback things, and knowing that there's 2 different ways to mix. Main mix, what everybody hears. Mix 3 is just what they have in their in-ears. So when they ask for something, hey, can you turn this up in the monitors or in my in-ears? Go there. Go to the thing it is, turn up a little bit. Now, like I said, if Josh is like, no, too much keyboard, now they've got to battle it out. They have to come to some kind of compromise. Again, a lot of times the solution is maybe bring everything down a little bit except for that thing that one of them can't hear, and then they can adjust their volume of themselves as far as overall volume, make it louder. But maybe the solution isn't to turn something up. Maybe it's to bring something else down a little bit. Anything else you guys want to know that we need to cover? And y'all will find stuff. There's stuff on this board that we didn't talk about. These boards now are nuts. They do so much stuff. This is PreSonus. This is a really good board. It's really easy to use. And there's tons of videos on YouTube, 20, 30-minute, hour videos where you can learn anything you want to learn about this, anything and everything. So, like I said, the reverb and stuff is stuff that y'all probably won't mess with on a daily basis, but you can run all those effects. Y'all have any of that stuff on now? So you can run all that stuff through there. The cool thing is with this board too, I don't know if y'all have it set up, but you can run reverb through individual channels and run reverb through your master too. So you can put a little bit of a room reverb on everything in the master. You can run subgroups and DCAs. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just zone out on this part. But DCAs, because this is like a one-time setup thing, DCAs are where, you can put individual, multiple, in any of these mixes, you can set up as subgroups or DCAs, any of these extra ones you're not using. So like, say you wanted to make 15 a DCA. What a DCA is you could put like, let's say you had 5 mics, vocal mics. You'll have some set up over there? Yeah. So you can run your DCAs like that. What a subgroup does, DCAs don't allow you to add, on this one, you can't add effects to the DCAs, I don't think, but subgroups you can. And subgroups pretty much do the exact same thing, but you can rerun effects into them. So like, let's say eventually y'all have overhead drum mics, let's say. Say one day you do a shield and you want to have more specific drum mics. But you don't want to constantly be having to turn up 3 or 4 microphones up and down every time you want it louder or quieter. So you can once you get a really good mix, you can put all of the drum mics into a subgroup, and then it's one overall, just like you run an electronic drum set. You can have one overall volume. You can still go back individually and change the mix of those 3 or 4, but then once you have it set the way you want it, you can run that one thing up and down to change the volume of the drums, but then instead of putting individual reverbs on everything, you can do that like a little bit on the snare, but not put it on anything else, but then you can put a reverb on the whole thing if you wanted to. So, and with electric, if Jimmy uses his big pedal thing that he's got, you probably don't need to put anything on it. If he's not using it, you might want to add a little bit of reverb. All right, I'm fixing to turn the mic off. Thanks, guys, for having me.